I'm going to discuss the third principle. Adolescents develop at different rates in the different realms of development, including the social, emotional, physical, and cognitive domains. It's important to keep these domains in mind, and they're also pictured here. And the important thing to note about these domains is that an adolescent can be very developed in one area or one circle, and not as developed in the other areas. Development is something that varies across domains and across time. And this relates to all of us, not just adolescents, but it's important to keep that in mind. And here's another way of thinking about it. There are times when your emotions are going, and that can impact your thinking. That can impact actually what's going on inside of you physically, and it can impact your social emotional, the way that you think and interact with other people. So it's important to keep in mind that the domains are very organic or flexible. So therefore, you can have an adolescent who can think really clearly in the morning, but then something happened to them at school, and when they come home, they're a very different person. Their emotions are going, and maybe their ability to think clearly is not the way that it was in the morning, or their ability to relate to you is not the same. Sort of, they come in and they're all huffy and puffy, and they go right to their room. But then you think, oh my goodness, this morning you were so pleasant. What happened? Aren't you the same person? That's a really good example of how a person's abilities across the domain changes with time and situation, and that's important to keep in mind. And as it pertains to court, that could explain why sometimes people will tell you that the minor, as they stand in front of you, is very mature, and then other people will describe them as immature, because those people could know them under different conditions, where their domains, maybe all of the circles are the same size, but if I see them in a different setting, although it's the same person, their ability to function can be impacted by the setting and their emotions. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now let's talk about different developmental concepts that are important. I'm going to be getting to these interchangeably, but I want to just go over them, lay them out once. Cognitive development, brain development, and psychosocial immaturity are very important concepts when you try to understand how and why adolescents behave as they do and think as they do. So one of the major changes that happens during adolescence is cognitive development. Now, I want to point out, I'm going to highlight, cognitive development is not the same as intelligence or IQ, because IQ includes executive functioning, which is a higher order functioning, that cognitive development does not consider that. So these are very different concepts, but important nonetheless. Cognitive development has to do with things such as thinking abstractly. So you can see that when you're in the car with your child who's 8 years old, for example, their thinking is not very abstract. It's very concrete. That's why there's some jokes they can't get, for example. However, drive in the car with a teenager 5 years later, and they're a teenager, they can get more abstract thinking. They can also think about the idea of thinking and understand that, and that's a very important concept. They can also think about different dimensions of an idea, of a concept at the same time. They can take different points of view. And so these are developmental changes that are cognitive changes that increase, but then during adolescence, they reach their peak. And so that's demonstrated here in a figure that's from an article by Steinberg et al., 2009. So that here we see that cognitive development increases until adolescence and then plateaus. And again, I want to underscore, this is different than IQ, because this does not include things such as executive functioning. So as I said, we've got cognitive changes. We've also got changes that have to do with the brain. And those changes happen on two levels. One, structurally, in that during adolescence, you've got two types of changes that increase the efficiency with which neurons send one message to the brain, send a message from one neuron to the other. It happens two ways. Myelination, the insulation around the neurons increases during adolescence, which allows the message to get from one neuron to the other effectively and to where it should go. So that's myelination is one way. Another way, you have a pruning. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concept that scientists throw around all the time, use it or lose it. And so what that really means is that in terms of the brain and the neurons will go away if they're not used. And the important thing of that going away process or pruning process is that it allows for messages to get from one neuron to the other more efficiently. So on the one hand, we've got two mechanisms that increase the efficiency with which messages get from one neuron to the other or from one part of the brain to the other. And that happens because of myelination, and it happens because of pruning. So that's one change. Another kind of change that we have is that we now think of the brain as being not just the lobes, the different parts of the brain, but we can think of it as having two systems as well. The cognitive control system, which is very important because the cognitive control helps you do things such as anticipate. If I do this, what's going to happen? The cognitive control system helps you to control your impulses, helps you to regulate emotions. Now, the cognitive control system isn't just one portion or one lobe of the brain. It's a system. And it's a system where messages are carried across the brain, but include the frontal lobe. And that's important to know on the prefrontal lobe. That's the portion of the brain that develops last. So what that means functionally is that the cognitive control system is the portion of the brain that comes fully on board last, that you can have the most control over, it takes the longest to happen. But it's also, one could argue, one of the most important systems because it helps you make more adult-like decisions. And that's really important to keep in mind. Although it comes aboard fully last, you can see adolescents demonstrating some of these skills, and I'll talk about that in a moment under certain situations. And I'm sure many of you have had the experience where you think, my goodness, your thinking was so good in this situation, but then get your friends or your emotions involved, and your thinking's not so good. And that's a normal process. And I'm going to talk about hot and cold cognition, which helps to explain that process. Another thing I should have said already is that the cognitive control system and the changes that happen with it, and also the other system, the social-emotional system, and the process of pruning and myelination are all normative process. We expect kids to go through this. It's similar to how you expect a toddler to crawl, walk, and run. There's some developmental changes in the progression that you expect. However, things can impact those changes and slow down the process. For example, if a toddler unfortunately breaks their leg, that may impact their ability to crawl. They can still get there once the leg is healed and once they've had rehab, for example. So you may have things that, and just as that toddler's crawling may have been impacted, for the adolescent, you can have things in their development that can impact their cognitive control system and social-emotional system. But put in the right circumstances and environment, those things that had negative impact, they can be rectified so you can get them on track with their same age developmental peers. So this normative process can be impacted by the environment and experiences in a negative way, but it can also be impacted in a very positive way and to correct things that have happened or gotten them off track from a developmental perspective. And I think that's really important for the judicial system to keep that in mind, the fact that although a youth may have had experiences that negatively impact their development in terms of social-emotional cognition or emotional development, you can also give them experiences that will get them back on track. And research has shown that they will benefit from these experiences often quicker than an adult would. And that's because the brain is still forming and very plastic, and which really means open to different experiences and more so able to accept them and to reap the benefits of them. So, but let's get back to the slide. So we've got the cognitive control system, which is a very important system, but one that builds up slowly in terms of being the prevailing system. You can see on the slide the different domains or the different areas that it's helpful for. Then you've got the social-emotional system, which is my favorite system. So that starts with adolescence and with the dopamine changes that happens during adolescence. And it makes it so that the adolescent wants to always have new experiences. It wants it so that they have difficulty, it makes it so they have difficulty controlling their emotions, they're sensation seeking. So they're really wanting novel new things, and they don't appreciate how these novel new things can get them in trouble. Now, the social-emotional system, sometimes it's called the risk and reward system. It makes it so that when an adolescent sees things, they are wired to see the rewards in it. What's good can come of this? And that's really what they're thinking about. And it's not a conscious thing. It's a thing that has to do with wiring. And I'll show you another study that has actually looked at how the brain functions when they're doing these things. And it's because of fMRI studies that we now have the science to help demonstrate, which I'm sure demonstrate what many of you have seen, which is adolescents think differently and they behave differently than adults. And the fMRI studies help us realize this is a normative process and one that they can't always control. So what we have now that we can see, there is psychosocial immaturity. That was our third concept. We had cognitive control, brain development, and psychosocial immaturity. And I want to explain the concept of psychosocial maturity. That is a composite term that includes things like ability to resist peer influence. It includes things like sensation seeking, impulsivity, time orientation. It helps to explain why adolescents are thinking about time as here and now. They're not very future oriented. That's why if you have a kid who's 15 and the probation officer is 23, the kid who's 15 thinks that 23-year-old person is ancient, because their time orientation is right now and is here and now. And so we've experienced also in a judicial context, it's why sometimes it might be hard for kids to understand why going to trial might be more beneficial than taking a plea. If for them the plea means they'll be out tomorrow, they may be more focused on the immediate benefits and having a harder time weighing the consequences of a longer-term possible solution, such as trial and how long that may take. So here what we see is that psychosocial maturity, which is the composite of the things such as sensation seeking, impulsivity, ability to resist peer influence. When I was in graduate school, they used to think of ability to resist peer influence was ability to resist peer pressure. And that term denotes sort of the do it now pressure, this outside pressure. But now because of the advancements of science, and we're talking about advancements that are not new or not novel, they've been around for at least 20 years, they've been replicated in different labs, and they've also been replicated in different countries. We see that the ability to resist peer influence, the influence of peers is subtle and is nebulous and is something that your ability to resist it increases as you age. So it's not just that your peers have to say, do it now, but it's really that you have to think your peers are watching you. That's enough to change how an adolescent thinks and behaves. And I'll show you a study that wonderfully demonstrates this. So this slide shows that psychosocial development increases with age. And psychosocial development is really important because it gets to the concepts that are talked about in Graham and in Miller and Montgomery and in JDB. And so those are really good examples of how the law is clearly referencing developmental concepts and the studies and the years of published research behind those concepts. So now I've talked about how you've got, on the one hand, cognitive control, which is at one level, as we can see here, but psychosocial maturity is at a different level, and that creates a maturity gap. So what that means is that you can think about some things and you might be able to reason on paper, but your ability to carry it through, which is really reflected in psychosocial maturity, isn't at the same level. And that's where the problem comes in. And that's why under some condition, a kid can give you the right answer, but then under different conditions, they can't demonstrate that ability. And another thing that goes toward that is hot and cold cognition. And basically, that's the idea that when your emotions are going, when it's a hot cognition or an idea that gets your emotions going, you don't think as clearly. And we see that with adults, but we see it more actively and more often with adolescents. The reason that we see it in the differences in the frequency with which it occurs is that the cognitive control system, the system that helps you say, stop, let's get our emotions, let's get our thoughts, let's get them clear, let's be level-headed, let's think this through, that system isn't fully on board for the adolescent. Therefore, that system is less likely to be the prevailing system when the adolescent is with their friends, when the adolescent is emotional. So they're really learning how, and it's not that they can control this. That's an important thing to keep in mind. This is how they're wired. It's a normative process. So you've got the significant impact of emotions on thinking. And remember before when I showed you the slide where you've got the overlapping circles, and that was a conscious choice because these things are interrelated, and it's important to keep that in mind as well. Now I'd like to show you, to review a study that I think very well demonstrates the impacts of peers on decision-making, behavior, and brain functioning. So here's the paradigm for this study. What people are asked to do is you're in the fMRI machine, which is basically this looks like a bubble. The person slides through, and they can do something in it. And also, while they're in the machine, the scientist, the machine is taking pictures of their brain, and the scientist can then put all the pictures together and see how their brain is functioning while they're doing the task. Here, the task is getting from the start line to the finish line, but there are traffic lights. And just like real life, you've got to decide what to do. And the person is told, I want you to get from the start to the finish as quickly as you can, and there's a small incentive in it for you. It's not a very large thing, but it's enough to get that adolescence, the social emotional, or the risk and rewards part of their brain really going. So what you have here is that you can stop and have a delay, which is what happens in real life. The light's going to change, it goes from yellow to red, you have a delay. Or at that yellow light, you get to decide, what do I do? I can either go through and it's fine, and you see that here, or I can go through and have a crash. And that picture of the crash windshield is exactly what the person would see when they're in the machine doing it. And unbeknownst to them, the situation where you go, but you have the crash, causes the longest delay. And I like to think of, one of the reasons that I like this experiment is that it's in real life. There have been times, I'm sure we've all had, where we're rushing, and then at some point we think, but if I'm in an accident, I'll be even later. And I'm going to be even more delayed. And that's really it's sort of that real life paradigm here in the study. Now, let's look at the findings. Here, we see that there is an increase. Well, I'm going to step back. The red is when they are in the peer condition, and I think it's important to know what the peer condition is in this study. Subjects were told, I'd like you to come to the lab and bring a friend. And then when they get to the lab, the friend is not in that little donut machine with them. The friend is in another room where the scientists are. And as they're doing this experiment, running that course from start to finish, at some point, the friend will say, hi, Johnny, or something like, Johnny, I see you're doing a good job. Not something as strong as, go faster, Johnny, you're a loser. That's like peer pressure, right? But instead, they sort of say something like, Johnny, good job, or nice going, something that is really more supportive, more positive, but certainly not as negative as peer pressure leads you to believe. And I think that's a really important point. Peers in the other room, okay? So they're not right there with them, and they say something that one could interpret as being supportive. It's certainly not a negative statement. So here, this study depicts the results and how it impacts decision-making. What we see is that for adolescents, make riskier decisions when in the peer condition. I think it's fascinating because the peer condition, the peer is in the other room. The adolescent who's in that machine just thinks they're being watched, okay? Now think about this in real life. In real life, these riskier decisions are made when the peer is right next to them, or often made with their peer. So this tells you if the peer in the other room can impact your behavior, think how greatly a young person's behavior is impacted when the peer is next to them. And so here, what's also important, I think, is to see in the alone condition. The alone condition for the adolescents is very similar to the alone condition for the adults. And again, this shows the idea that sometimes adolescents can act like adults, and their cognitive control system can be the prevailing system. But as this demonstrates, it's not the case when they believe their peers are watching or when they're with their peers. Now, remember, at the bottom here, you can conceptualize that as being risky decision, but not every risky decision results in a risky outcome. But now let's look at that and see if it's what actually happens. Here we see the outcome, looking at how many times do you run the light, but then you actually have a crash. And here we see more crashes for adolescents in the peer condition than in the alone condition. And similarly, in the alone condition, adolescents are acting more like adults. So the things to keep in mind here from this part of this study is that under certain conditions, adolescents can act similarly to adults. Those conditions, though, you're not likely to see that behavior when they're with their peers or they believe their peers are watching. Under those conditions, they're more likely to make riskier decisions that result in riskier outcomes. So that's great, but you may ask yourself, why does this happen? Okay, we see this happening. There have been a series of studies like this where they asked the kids, did you know you were acting differently when you thought your peers were watching? And it's consistently, they have no idea. They think they're doing it the same. So what that really means is they're being influenced by their peers and they don't even recognize the influence of their peers. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. So the real thing that I love is answering the question, but how's their brain functioning when they're doing this? And what we see here is that the brain functions differently. Let's start on the slide on the left. That has to do with cognitive control system. And what we can see there is the cognitive control system is most engaged for adults and least engaged for adolescents. And the other side of the chart has to do with the social-emotional system. And as expected, it's exactly the opposite. The social-emotional or risk and reward system is most engaged for the adolescents and most engaged when their peers are involved. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. We're talking about a developmental change that is a part of wiring, that is a normative process that's going on. There are things that can make it more extreme, but this is a normative process. And I think that it's important to keep in mind that we should expect kids, especially when they're with other kids, to make decisions that, A, they wouldn't make on their own, and to make decisions that are not like those of adults. And they're really wired to do so, and this is a normative process. Okay, the next research I'd like to show you has to do with ability to see risk versus potential negative consequences. And what we know, I'm just going to give you the punchline because I think it's so amazing, is that there is a developmental difference in your ability to identify risk versus potential consequences and to weigh them. And this matters in real life significantly because I think that as adults, whose cognitive control system is more often the prevailing system, we can recognize potential risk involved in a situation when an adolescent doesn't see it. I imagine that there are times on the bench that you might want to say to a young person, didn't you know that bad thing could happen? And in fact, the research that I'm going to show you strongly indicates that they didn't know it was going to happen. When they thought about doing it, what they thought were all the potential rewards that could happen and not the potential dangers. And I really urge lawyers to keep that in mind, that kids, adolescents, as a normative part, see things differently. And that reward bias, which is what these authors have coined the term, which is the tendency to see more rewards in a situation than potential risk. What I think is interesting is that reward bias holds for kids who are in the community, who've never been involved in the justice system, as well as for kids who've been locked up. you would think that the kids who've been locked up, because they're experiencing the negative outcome of their decision, will be more able to think of and to imagine negative outcomes and less likely to think of rewards, but that's not so. So in this study, what they did was they asked youth, there was over 1,000 youth from different parts of the country, which is important because you can't say this is a New York thing or this is an Indiana thing. In fact, these are kids from all over the country, which helps the reliability and the validity of the findings. So we asked the kids to imagine yourself doing dangerous things, such as going in a store and robbing someone. Certainly, I'm sure at times you will have kids who've committed that crime. Fighting is another thing that they asked them to imagine themselves doing. They asked them to imagine themselves drinking alcohol. Now, the important thing from a psychological perspective is they didn't just ask them to read the vignette, but they asked them to imagine themselves doing it. And when you imagine yourself doing it, different parts of your brain are enacted. And that's a mentalizing, and it's a very important thing to keep in mind. So they said, picture yourself having a fight. Picture yourself doing these. Picture yourself stealing. Tell me the good things that could happen and the potential dangerous things. Kids think of more good things. So, for example, picture yourself stealing. A kid thinks of, I'm going to get what I went in there to steal for. A kid's less likely to think of things like, that store, the person working in the store may have a gun, and I could get shot. We could struggle over the gun. He could get shot. Someone else in the store could get shot. And they're less likely to think of, I could get caught. And that's sort of a basic thing. But instead, they're more likely to think of the reward of stealing, which is getting that object I wanted. Now, what we see is that there's a developmental trend in reward bias such that it peaks in late adolescence. And one color bar is for the kids who are in the community, and the other color bar is for the kids who are involved in the legal system. And it doesn't matter which one is which because the graph is basically the same. And so that's the point, that this reward bias is strong for kids, be they involved in the justice system or not involved. That also speaks to the idea of often as adults with more fully functioning cognitive control systems, we think you should learn from your behavior. It doesn't work that way with adolescents. It's not that simple. There are these other things that can impact their thinking, being with their peers, emotions. The fact that their social-emotional system is still the prevailing system makes it so that they don't get the same lessons from behavior that we expect them to get or that we would get if we were an adult doing that same behavior. And I think if one reflects on that, you can think about things that you did as an adolescent that were dangerous, that were risky, and you did them more than once. You didn't learn from it. And even after you got caught and grounded for a week and whatever, you couldn't see your friends, once you saw your friends after that week, you did the same thing again. So many of us have had that experience, those experiences growing up. Why have many of us had those experiences? Because they're normative, and they're a normal part of growing up. And I think so, risk and reward bias, the idea that you are, as an adolescent, primed to see rewards and not so to see the risk, the idea that you're sensation-seeking, the idea that you haven't learned as an adult would think you would from your prior experiences are part of what it's like to grow up, and it's a normative process of growing up. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about some developmental changes that have to do with compliance with authority. And this is from a Gristle et al. Study in 2003. I want to say a couple things that are sort of side but important with this study. This is a great study because it helps us to understand adolescents' competency ability, and they use the MCAT for that. And I'm not going to talk about the MCAT study itself, but I do want you to know that the MCAT has not been normed to be used in a clinical sense with adolescents, but has only been normed to be used for research with adolescents. So if you're on the bench and you see that an adolescent has been administered the MCAT, you really should think about whether or not that was appropriate, because there are studies to demonstrate that it's not appropriate for a clinical setting. So I just sort of put that out there. But on the next two studies, I'm actually going to talk about another instrument that was used in that study that, again, has not been validated to be used clinically, but has a lot of empirical findings that are useful clinically and are useful for judges and lawyers to know about. And that instrument was the MECGEN. And what we see here is that compliance with authority changes developmentally with age. You are more likely to comply with authority and go along with authority the younger that you are, and less likely the older you are, the more through adolescence or into young adulthood that you are. This has really significant impact on things like ability to provide a knowing, intelligent, and voluntary waiver, ability to truly demonstrate understanding of the probation order, whether or not the kid is just complying with authority by saying yes and they don't really understand these things. So I think it's important to keep in mind that compliance with authority changes by age, and this can impact different areas in the life of a case, as well as how the youth interacts with their attorney and who could be really making the decisions in that relationship. So it's just something to be aware of and cognizant of, and to know that there's a normative developmental process, but like any normal developmental process, most of them can be impacted by individual experiences, by mental health issues, by learning disabilities, and there are different things that can change it. But here we're talking about what you should expect just based upon age alone. Now, this study looks at, in this study, subjects were asked to say what is the best outcome or the best thing they should do in an interrogation situation. It's important to note again that these are more than 1,000 subjects. They were ages 11 to 25, and they were collected from subjects across the country. And here is a fascinating thing. We see two developmental trends happening. One, the younger the kid is, the more likely they are to think that it is in their best interest to talk to police. So, and think about this too, if you can overlap in your mind the previous slide, which also showed compliance with authority was higher the younger that you are. These things go together then. So we have got one developmental trend, which is the younger you are, the more likely you are to think that you should talk to the police. But then the other developmental trend is that the older you are, the more likely you think that you should be silent. But what I think is really important is look at how close the bars are with regard to silence or make a confession when you're 14 to 15. There's a lot of research that shows how 14 to 15-year-old kids who are 15 and younger are vulnerable and not able to provide a knowing, intelligent, and voluntary waiver. And you can see how close those bars are. It's as if the kid doesn't really know which is in their best interest. This is a developmental period for them, whereas the older kids have a clearer idea that staying silent is in their best interest, and the younger kids have a clearer idea, although one could argue if it's really truly in their best interest, but they have a clear idea that talking is in their best interest. So where those two lines meet visually is really the 14 to 15-year-old, where you see some change, but yet you don't know what's going to be the outcome. And there's a whole other series of research that demonstrates this. Now I'd like to talk about how kids can change and as it applies to criminal or illegal activity. This is a study in which they followed youth, including youth who had committed murder, for 7 years. And what we see here is that, and they divided them into groups, some who committed crimes early and at high rates but then stopped, other kids who were like middle-level kids, so we see that different ages and different groups. But the take-home here is that most of the kids, by the time they were 25, stopped engaging in illegal activity, including those kids who were convicted of committing murder. So therefore, we're not talking about just misdemeanor kids. The other thing that this study demonstrates that I think is a very important point is that as youth become more mature regarding their psychosocial maturity, which again, things like ability to resist peer influence, impulsivity, sensation seeking, those things. As they become more mature in those realms of development, then they are less likely to engage in illegal activity. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. And again, they've demonstrated this by following youth for 7 years. So this isn't just how much did you grow up in this 1 year, but looking at youth, and what happens is that and these aren't youth who've had extreme interventions, but these are youth that they're following them in the same course that they didn't have the judge do something different with these youth just because they were in this study. So they followed the youth for 7 years, and what we can see is that most of the youth will stop their involvement in illegal activity, and that just happens as the youth grow up. And we also see that as youth become more mature with regard to psychosocial maturity, then also their involvement in illegal activities will stop.